Hi, this is John Horgan. This podcast is an outgrowth of a book I recently wrote called Mind-Body Problems. You can read it for free online at mindbodyproblems.com. The book profiles 9 thinkers, and it draws connections between their theories about the mind and their personal lives. On this podcast, I talk to the subjects of my book and to other mind-body experts. If you want to respond to any of these conversations or to my book, please email me at jhorgan@highlands, HIGHLANDS.com. And remember, you can read my book online for free at mindbodyproblems.com. I hope you enjoy the show. Christof, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, John. Good afternoon.
Hey, good to see you. So I'll just go through the introductions. My name is John Horgan. I'm a science writer. I'm a longtime correspondent for Blogging Heads TV / Meaning of Life TV, and now Mind Body Problems. And with me today is Christof. Here's one thing I want to establish right now. How do I pronounce your last name?
It's like Loch in Loch Lomond, in Scotland. Koch. Christof Koch. Yes.
I have a hard time saying that.
I understand.
I've heard it as Koch. I've heard it as Koch. I've heard it as Koch. Now you say Koch.
Koch, yes. Just like think of Loch Lomond. Most Americans have no difficulty saying Loch Lomond.
Okay. I'm going to call you Christof.
Yes.
Okay. And I'm really glad you're here. So we're here to talk about the mind-body problem, consciousness, and all this different stuff. And I'm hoping that you have read some of this this book that I just wrote called Mind-Body Problems, because Christof, you're the reason I wrote the damn book.
I saw that acknowledgement, that call out, yes, in your introduction.
Yeah, so I describe how that happened in the introduction, and I just want to say that you've been a really important part of my career as a science journalist. We go way back to the early 90s. I went back through my Christof Koch file while I was writing this book on the mind-body problem, and I found notes from conversations that we had going back at least to 1992, and I realized that you also could be blamed for me writing The End of Science, because we had this conversation in 92. I was writing some stupid piece for Scientific American on, what's happening in science. And we started talking about the limits of science. And you told me about a Thomas Mann book. In which
the confession of the confidence man, Felix Krull.
Yes. And you said there was a character in it. I don't know if it was Felix Krull himself, who was talking about some problems that might never be solved. The origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the nature of consciousness, I think it was.
Yes.
And that was a big theme of my book, that those 3 big problems will probably never be solved. So, as I said, you've had a big influence on me. But let me just allow you to explain who you are, and what you're doing right now, and how you got there, in like 20 seconds.
All right. My current position is I'm the chief scientist and the president of the Allen Institute for Brain Science here in Seattle. So we are a 330 person institute, non-for-profit, started by Paul, who just passed away a couple of weeks ago. And our mission is to accelerate neuroscience, to accelerate discovery in the brain sciences. So everything we do, we focus on the human brain and the mouse brain. We do things that can't be done easily at universities, like large-scale projects, and everything we do, we make available to everybody else freely and publicly. Mm-hmm. And before, I was for 27 years a professor at Caltech, and my personal passion that I could spend a lot of time at Caltech and much less now, of course, is to try to understand consciousness, to try to understand from a point of view of a physicist turned biologist, how the brain gives rise to our experience, our sense of who we are.
Right. And so our first conversation back in the early 90s was also about consciousness and whether that can be explained. And then I heard you give a talk in 1994 at the very first conference on consciousness in Tucson, which has now become this gigantic thing held every 2 years.
Yes.
It's gotten a little wacky. Is it fair to say?
Yes, it's the Woodstock of consciousness research.
Yes, right. And I talk about your influence on my own views of consciousness in my book. I wonder if you could first start by saying, what's the difference between consciousness, the problem of consciousness, and the mind-body problem, if there is any? Do you equate the two? Or is the mind-body problem a little bit different?
I mean, depends who you ask. For me, the mind-body problem is this large agglomeration of things like free will. Do you have it, and how is it compatible with science? Mm-hmm. Personal identity. What makes me me and different from you? So there's a number of problems. But really, right at the heart, the beating heart of it is the most challenging problem of all. How is it that a piece of furniture of the universe, as I say, a piece of physical matter can give rise to feelings? How can anything give rise to feelings? That's always been the challenge from, the days of Aristotle, who first thought and wrote about it, until today. And
starting in the late 80s, you had this partnership with Francis Crick, and we're proposing a kind of research plan for how consciousness could be solved. First of all, I realized I don't think you ever told me how you met Crick in the first place. Could you tell us that? Do you recall it?
Yeah, I met Francis Crick. He was visiting my advisor. So I got my PhD in Germany, and he was visiting my advisor, and I met him on an apple tree. He invited there was a party in his celebration, and as part of that, the entire research group did a hike in the local mountains, and then we rested in the afternoon in this apple orchard, and he was sort of resting, on the ground with his head against the tree, and we started talking. It's the first time I talked to the great man. I was a lowly second-year graduate student. He was sort of this half-god in science, and so then I started talking with him, and we talked for a couple of days. And even at that age, he was already, way past sort of conventional retirement age, but still at the time, he wanted to know all the details. He was really focused on details. Science ultimately is all about the little details, the mechanisms and numbers and parameters, and do they fit? And he kept on probing. So at the time, I was making one of the first computer models of the brain cells, and he wanted to know this and that, and what happens if you change this parameter and jack this one up and reduce this to 0, what happens? Always, and this was sort of the mode. I knew him till literally the day he died. The day he died in hospital, he was dictating correction to the last paper we wrote, and he still had questions. And in fact, his wife told me that 2 hours before he passed away, he had a fever, so he was starting to hallucinate. He had this hallucinatory discussions with me about neurons and about what would happen to particular type of neurons. As scientist, from the first moment I met him until sort of his last, literally dying breath.
Yeah, I like to tell students that, I've been lucky enough to interview a lot of the greatest scientists in the 20th century. And I like to tell students that I think Crick had what may be the most perfect mind for solving scientific problems of anybody I've ever met. And part of it was that he didn't let his ego get in the way. I sort of felt like, he had a big ego. He was extremely self-confident. But if you could show him why his theory or his idea was wrong, he would get rid of it in a second. He wasn't personally invested in his own ideas. He just wanted to understand what the hell is going on out there in nature.
That's correct. I mean, he kept on saying, so, you know, I was at Caltech at the time in Pasadena. He was in La Jolla, so I went down there once a month for 3 days. And we had these long discussions in his studies where he said, well, maybe everything we're thinking is wrong. Maybe everything we said so much isn't right. What is it really that we need to explain? What are really the basic facts? How do they map onto each other? So it's precisely as you said, he had very little ego in that search itself. And in the afternoon, often when we went to the Salk Institute, he had this talk, the afternoon tea. And at those teas, he talked with undergrads, with grad students, with staff, with anybody who had an interesting story to share. He wouldn't, you know, he wouldn't tolerate fools lightly. But if you had something interesting, particularly some interesting facts, or you could show him, as you said, that somewhere he'd said something that probably wasn't right, he was more than glad to listen to you. And that's rare. That's very rare among people in general, and also among scientists.
Yeah, and especially scientists who've won Nobel Prizes who can tend toward arrogance.
Correct.
So I wonder if you can talk about your commitment, or how the whole idea of the neural correlates of consciousness emerged, and how committed you were to that. So when I met you, you had already been writing about that for a while. I think you first wrote the first joint articles with Crick in the late 80s. Is that right?
89 in 1990. The first 2 papers came out in 1990. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the idea was that, you know, so broadly speaking, for thousands of years, people, particularly philosophers, but also over the late 19th century and early 20th century, of course, had thought about consciousness, right? It's one of the oldest problems. But by and large, most of that was focused on very sophisticated, heuristic, metaphysical, philosophical ideas and speculation, which is all fine. You need that. But then ultimately, you have to come down, you know, to actual brass tacks and to actually look at the brain. And so we said, well, let's formulate a simple operational program that anybody, no matter whether you're dualist or an idealist or materialist or panpsychist, whatever, we can all agree there are going to be some footprints of consciousness in our body. Mm-hmm. Historically, people associated with the heart, right? That's why you still say to your girlfriend, I love you with all my heart. Well, you should actually say, I love you with all my hypothalamus, but that doesn't sound quite as romantic. So today we know it's this thing inside the skull that gives rise to my mind, right? So let's agree on a research program to systematically track down the footprints of consciousness in the brain. Not just the entire brain, because we know you can lose some parts of your brain. So for instance, your spinal cord is part of your brain, but if you lose it, you become paralyzed, right? We know this in quadriplegia, but your consciousness doesn't change. So that tells us very simply, it can't just be any sort of neural activity. It's got to be something more than that. And so you can systematically walk through the brain, and we discussed a number of techniques how to do that, to try to identify what are the bits and pieces of neuronal matter, of this very excitable piece of neuronal matter that gives rise to any one conscious sensation, whether it's seeing you or hearing me or remembering something or being upset. Those are all different conscious experiences. And then you can ask what's common about them. If I see you or hear you or dream of you, is it always the same set of neural mechanisms, or are they different? Are they in different parts of the brain? Do they look different? Is there something common about them? Is there a common set of genes involved? How did they develop? Are they already there in the baby? What happens if you have a stroke or schizophrenia? So all those things are open to this sort of empirical program, based on lab experiments in people, in patients, in animals, to track down what's now known as NCC, the neuronal correlates of consciousness.
So at that meeting, where I first heard you speak, when I first met you, we talked over the phone, but this is where I first actually met you in the flesh. David Chalmers was also there. So you gave this talk expressing the neural correlates of consciousness approach very eloquently, the way you just did now, and talking about the different kinds of research that could be done to help figure out what's going on in the brain that corresponds to consciousness. Meanwhile, David Chalmers, who was an unknown, at this time. This young guy who looked like a bass player in a rock band or something with really long hair, and he gave a talk. I don't know if you were in the audience. I definitely was, and I think a lot of people. My impression is that a lot of people were kind of sleepy. It was in the morning, I think, and they needed more coffee or something. But they gradually began perking up because Chalmers used this phrase, the hard problem, and it was trying to explain why understanding consciousness, quality, these subjective experiences, is a different kind of problem than pretty much any other kind of scientific problem, right? That it's not amenable to the same kinds of methods, empirical methods, research methods, that other scientific problems can be solved by. And I just wonder, so you said you were there. What was your reaction when you first heard him?
Baloney. I just have this psychological aversion to somebody telling me you can never do this.
Right.
This is just obvious. That's just a purely psychological reaction. You don't like it. But B, I mean, in my opinion, at the time, philosophers keep on telling scientists the limits of science. And, so far, yes, there are probably limits of science and we can discuss those. And yes, consciousness is clearly more difficult to study than just digestion, for instance. But that doesn't mean science can't make meaningful progress. Will it fully explain the mystery? That really depends on what you mean by fully and what you consider an adequate explanation. Will every practical question, is this patient conscious? Why is this patient having visions? Is that creature over there conscious? Those are all empirical questions that ultimately will have empirical answers. If you can answer all of those questions, then there is another legitimate question to ask, is that sufficient as an explanation? Or do you really want to know, well, why does it feel like anything? And those why questions in general, I grant Chalmers, have been very difficult to answer. It's like, why is there anything rather than nothing? That doesn't seem like a question science could ever answer. And so maybe in that deepest sense, why does it feel? But if I have maybe that cannot be answered. But if I have a rational explanation, which systems give rise to what type of consciousness, I can predict what you're conscious of. I can predict in other people, patients, animals, etc. For me, I can go to my grave happily knowing that there is that sort of answer and that I've helped contribute in some sense towards achieving that answer.
Okay, so another part of Chalmers' talk that is generally not mentioned that much, but I think was really important, was that he then proposed a kind of very general possible solution to the problem of consciousness, which involved information. My understanding was that he was talking about information in the sense that it's used in information theory, and that information has a kind of physical aspect and then an experiential aspect. He was kind of hand waving, it wasn't very explicit, but that was his idea. And then this is one of the high points of my career. I saw you and Chalmers meet each other at a cocktail party, and you started yelling at him about how foolish his idea was. And Chalmers is trying to defend himself, and it was really great stuff. I just wanted to know if you remember that conversation, or if you could just explain your reaction to Chalmers' idea about information and consciousness.
As far as I recall, I liked it. And so I wrote a review of his book for Nature. So his idea, the heart problem, comes out of sort of his PhD thesis that he did, and he wrote it in a book called The Conscious Mind. I have it here, where he talks about the heart problem. And at the end, he has an appendix where he talks about a possible solution. As you said, he outlined sort of, maybe any information-bearing device also has this subjective aspect to it. And you're right, their information is information in the standard sense. We use it in the Shannon sense of, bits of information that allow me to reconstruct for example, a picture or a text. And that that sounded intriguing, although it was completely fuzzy and it didn't lead to any concrete proposal, but that sort of sounded intriguing. But at the time I was fully dedicated. Let's just forget about all this philosophy. Philosophy hasn't helped us all that much over the last, several thousand years. Let's just focus on the empirical stuff, the stuff that we can do.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So now let's jump ahead. And I guess, I don't know, to 2007, 2008. But actually first, let me say that my impression of you in promoting the neural correlates of consciousness was that you were pretty modest in your claims. You were saying that some of these deep philosophical problems might not be solved in this way. And I thought you were saying that some of them might never be solved. But we're still going to do, as you say, but we're still going to solve all these practical problems on the way. But the neural correlates of consciousness was restricted to brains pretty much. So it didn't necessarily solve problems about, whether entities without brains could be conscious, whether computers can be conscious, all that kind of stuff was sort of set to the side, at least for the time being.
Yeah, I believe I cited the well-known American existentialist philosopher Dirty Harry from Clint Eastwood, A Man's Got to Know His Limitations. Yes, there may well be limitations, but let's not worry about them, because sort of it's a defeatist attitude, worrying before you even get there. Well, maybe I can't climb the mountain because there are some, principal limits. Let's just go try climb the mountains and just do as best as we can. Yeah. And at the time, once again, was focused, because what happened in the late, sort of in the 80s and 90s? Several things happened. There was a discovery of the routine use of brain scanners. So now if you had a conscious thought, I could put you in a scanner and I can see, well, here, this part of the brain lights up every time you look at a face. Or even if you imagine a face, it lights up. And over there, it lights up when you hear a tune, right? So I can make sort of these ephemeral things, thoughts, I can now make them visible. That's incredible exciting. And then also we can do similar things in animals, in trained animals. And of course, in animals, I not only see big blobs of light in a scanner, but I can actually query the underlying nerve cells. I can see this nerve cell responds very selectively, and the neighboring cell that looks no different doesn't respond at all, or responds in a very different way. And then there was also the birth of neural networks, sort of the idea that we can use computer models to model all of that. And so there was a lot of excitement. And so the argument was, let's just focus on these exciting techniques in modeling and in experimental and cognitive neuroscience and psychology to try to nail this problem once and for all.
Right. I wonder if you could just briefly describe the experiments that I wrote about that you were involved in. This is shortly after 2000. This was experiments in which electrodes are inserted into the brains of epileptics, and you're monitoring individual brain cells and trying to understand how or whether they can recognize individual faces. This is sort of it was sometimes described as the Bill Clinton.
Jennifer Aniston. The technical term that's in the textbook is Jennifer Aniston neurons.
Okay. Yeah, it was just the technique was mind-blowing to me. And also some of the stuff that you were finding. So I wonder if you could just briefly describe what that was about.
Yeah, so it's a very rare occasion that neurosurgeons have to put electrode into the brain of patients, as you said, who are epileptic seizures, and their seizures can't be controlled by pharmacology, by drugs, or can't be controlled anymore. And then one very successful alternative for some epileptic patients is to try to pinpoint exactly if they have one focus, one point in the brain from which these seizures, these hyper-synchronized electrical activity originates and then spreads and engulfs the entire brain. Because if you can remove that focus, very often the patient will cease to have any seizures for many years or maybe even for the rest of their life. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you can see these foci from outside using imaging. But in many cases you can. And then what you do, you lower electrodes into the brain. So you do an operation where you put electrodes either, well, typically like this, into the brain of the patients. And then the patient stays in the hospital for a week or two. And when the patient has seizures, you can sort of monitor. It's like EEG, but it's much closer because you're inside the skull. You can monitor and pinpoint and triangulate exactly from which point these seizures originate. And then, so this was done with a surgeon called Itzhak Fried, an Israeli-American surgeon at UCLA. And then what he did, he took those big electrodes and he inserted inside those big electrodes tiny wires. So now you have these tiny metal wires inside the brain that can sort of listen to the discharge of neurons. And you can pick up individual nerve cells. And then what we discovered serendipitously, that if you have a patient in a hospital bed and he has this big turban on because there are these electrodes, and then there's wires going to a computer by his bed. Then he or she's looking at images, and you show images of loved ones and family and celebrities and TV shows, etc. And then it turns out there are neurons, individual neurons that respond very, very selectively. Let's say only to Jennifer Aniston or only to Bill Clinton. But it could be different pictures of Bill Clinton, but it wouldn't respond to this one neuron, for example, would only respond to Bill Clinton, but not to Jennifer Aniston. Another neuron responds to Jennifer Aniston, or cartoon of Jennifer Aniston, or Jennifer Aniston in one of her shows. Some neurons respond to the text. We had a neuron that responded to pictures. This was at the time of the Iraq War, to Saddam Hussein, to a voice saying Saddam Hussein, and to the text Saddam Hussein. So, the individual neurons that seem to respond in an amazingly selective way to things that we perceive. And the general lesson here is that so we have roughly 100 billion neurons in our head, roughly. As many neurons in our head as there are stars in our Milky Way galaxy. And these neurons respond in very specific and in very particular ways. And ultimately, we all believe that the firing of these neurons, at least a subset of these neurons, that's what ultimately gives rise to the picture in my head. Right now, I have of you, for instance, talking to me.
Yeah, what I love, the phrase that you used when you were describing this to me was that the cells had somehow encoded the platonic ideal of Jennifer Aniston. So it wasn't a particular instantiation of Jennifer Aniston. It was the concept of Jennifer Aniston, which can actually take an almost infinite variety of particular forms. And the context in which I understood this, and this is how you explained to me, and why I thought it was really profound, was that this could be a little part of the neural code. I only started, I think you were the first person to use that phrase, that's where I first heard it from you. The neural code, as I understand it, it's kind of the software program of the brain, or the language of the brain, the algorithms, the rules that dictate how information is processed in the brain. And if we can figure out the neural code, maybe that will help us solve the problem of consciousness, maybe free will, some of these old philosophical puzzles. It also can give us enormous power over our brains. Because if we can understand the neural code of our brains, we can learn how to manipulate our brains, control our brains, read minds, in the same way that happens primarily in science fiction now.
Yeah, and that's entirely correct. It's just over the last that's entirely correct. That's still the belief of myself and most of my fellow neuroscientists. It is, though, each new generation of neuroscientists is always challenged by the brain because we discover yet more complexity. It's a little bit like the history of astronomy over the last 200 years. Each new generation of astronomers gets better and better tools that allow us to peer farther and farther into the universe, and we find the universe is a bigger and a bigger and a bigger and a bigger structure. Right now we're talking about multiverses even. And so in neuroscience, we just published, so at the Allen Institute, just today, we published a large article in Nature, the international journal Nature, where we describe this discovery that neurons are not all like neurons. In fact, if you look at a detailed part, a tiny bit of part of the mouse brain, and we know now because we're also doing it in the human brain, it's very similar in the human brain, particularly in the cerebral cortex, the outermost shell. They're not just neurons, they're not just two types of neurons, excitatory and inhibitory neurons. There are probably at least 100 types of different neurons. So if you want to understand the code, the neural code, it's not just important to know that this neuron spiked and fired an action potential and this one didn't, but you also need to know which of the 100 different types it is, which is very different from the way, for example, our computers work. Typically in a CPU or an ALU or a GPU, there's one or two types of transistors, and they're all alike, and you've got billions of them that make up your iPhone or your laptop. In the human brain is built along very different architectures, has hundreds of different cell types, and for the neural code, it's critical to understand which the different makeup of all these different types and how they relate to each other. So it's just gotten a whole lot more complicated.
All right, so now this has all been a build-up, as you probably realize, to integrated information theory. And,
really?
And it was your embrace, that's how I describe it, maybe that's too strong, of this theory that it really surprised me. And then I saw you give a workshop on it at NYU. I think this is in 2015. And I was astonished by the implications of the theory. And I was astonished that you, of all people, who had always been this really sort of hard-nosed person, the collaborator with Francis Crick on promoting this kind of nitty-gritty empirical approach to understanding consciousness. You were advocating this theory with really quite extraordinary implications. And so I wonder if you can first tell us what the theory is, and then why you decided to take it so seriously.
All right, so first, the integrated information theory, or abbreviated IIT. So I'm not, I didn't develop it. It's a close friend of mine, the Italian-born American neuroscientist and psychiatrist Giulio Tononi. So what does IIT say? IIT makes this very sort of highfalutin claim that ultimately consciousness is, and it's going to sound weird, is intrinsic causal power. It's the ability of any system, like a brain, or maybe one of these devices, or the brain in a dog or in a worm. It's the ability of a system to sort of to affect to be affected by its past and to influence its future. In other words, you have a complicated system in a state, and depending on the exact states, the system has lots of different possibilities what it could be in the next fraction of a millisecond. And it calls this ability, it calls integrated information. It's nothing to do with information in the sense we used it before, in the common Shannon information sense. Shannon information requires a sender and a receiver. I'm sending now, I'm speaking. So in a conventional sense, I'm transmitting information from me to you. I'm a sender, you're the receiver. Your brain is receiving it. When I have an experience, it's a character of any experience. There is no sender, there is no receiver, right? There's nobody else is listening to it. There's no other observer. So that's also what was wrong with Chalmers' idea about information. It's not sort of about bits of information that you have in a CD-ROM. It's how much difference a system can make to itself. All right. So what's elegant about the theory, it's a formal theory. You can write it down in mathematics. In other words, so you can make some very precise predictions. It's causal. It's not just a correlation. It says this is ultimately what consciousness is, and it can be tested, and it makes indeed some very surprising predictions, both about how you can measure consciousness in people, in animals, and also who has it and who doesn't have it. Now, in terms of, so just to step back a little bit, we met, Francis Crick and I had several conversations with Giulio Tononi because at the time he was working with Jerry Edelman, who's another Nobel laureate. He got his Nobel Prize for working on the immune system. And Giulio was working with sort of Jerry Edelman, similar to I was working with Francis Crick. And at the time, Francis also was intrigued by this theory. Why do we need a theory at all? That's really the question, John. To me, it was pointed out, I had this epiphany. I gave a talk in Zurich, in Switzerland, on NCC and the current status of NCC. And then somebody asked me at the end, he said, well, okay, granted everything you're saying is correct. Granted there's going to be this signature of consciousness. At the time, everybody, and we were interested in these 40 Hertz oscillations, the tendency of neurons to fire, 40 times a second. And we thought that was one of the signatures of consciousness in the brain. And he said, okay, assuming this is correct, why 40 Hertz? Why not 30 Hertz? Is 30 Hertz not good enough? Or is 50 Hertz not good enough? What's magical about 40 Hertz? Why is this different from what 350 years earlier, René Descartes said, it's a pineal gland. So he famously said, the pineal gland is where sort of matter meets the mind in modern language. And today we laugh at that. Well, why is your theory more different? I mean, you clearly know vastly more facts than Descartes did, but other than that seems to be, it's just like, you find a lamp, you rub it, and then the genie appears, right? Totally out of the blue. So ultimately, you have to explain why any mechanism, no matter what mechanism, if it's these neurons over here with those genes or those neurons with this other gene, why is it that this mechanism gives rise ultimately to feelings? And for that, you really need a fundamental theory. And Francis Crick was perfectly cognizant of that. Yeah. So that doesn't mean that you abandon the empirical search for the footprints of consciousness, but you have to ask beyond that. Once I have those footprints, why these footprints and not some others?
Yeah, it seemed to me that the biggest limitation of the neural correlates of consciousness was also its strength. You're saying that we know consciousness is a property of human brain, so let's try to find out why a human brain produces it. But what you really want is a general theory of consciousness that can explain why consciousness rises out of matter at all. And it should be able to explain whether it can arise from other entirely different physical systems, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it is a unique property to human brains, but you want to know why that is. So it has to be something that goes much deeper than our particular physical form, or maybe even deeper than just the brains of mammals, let's say. And so that's the power, but that's the power of the theory. But we need to talk about panpsychism. So the theory, according to your own writing, it implies that this is the way I understand it. I find your theory very, very difficult to understand, but you've written very clearly about it. In some of your articles for Scientific American. I understand it as sort of, you've got a system with interacting parts, and somehow their interactions produce something that is more than the sum of its parts. So synergy kind of captures this quality, and synergy is related to this property called phi, which you say is proportional in some sense to consciousness. And in one of your articles, you said that a single proton, which has 3 interacting quarks, could have a little bit of phi, a little bit of synergy, and therefore have a little bit of consciousness. And that is quite an extraordinary claim because, of course, protons pervade the entire universe. And so that suggests that consciousness pervades the entire universe. And this is the ancient mystical doctrine of panpsychism. This is what blew my mind when I first started reading about the theory. So I wonder if you can how are you feeling about panpsychism at this point?
So it's not panpsychism. It shares certain IIT shares certain intuitions with panpsychism, but it also solves its biggest weakness. We can talk about that later, the so-called combination problem. Well, yeah, so let's step back. So in science, in general, we progress. We have some empirical observation. We try to put them together into a larger picture. And so we establish theories, like the theory of evolution or the theory of electromagnetism. right, that unifies a whole set of disparate phenomena. And then this theory might imply very new things that haven't been tested till then, like radio wave. Or in the case of general relativity, it seems to imply, well, they're actually these gravitational waves. And then 100 years later, we can measure them. And, we find them like LIGO. Or quantum mechanics really predict some pretty weird stuff. All the entanglement and the decoherence. That's really totally contrary to our intuition. But it's the best tested theory bar none, and half of our technological infrastructure is based on sort of quantum mechanical effect. And so the science, that's what it does. Now, that doesn't mean that every strange theory is true. In fact, most scientific theories turn out to be wrong. And so this may also be the case with IoT. It makes some prediction, and of course they could all be wrong, and I admit that, and it's still very early days, and ultimately it's an empirical question, right? But on the other hand, also psychologically, if you write about it and you think about it, you've got to commit yourself. It's just like going on a climb. You can't constantly say, okay, I'm going to climb this hard thing, and I'm constantly doubt, is this the right thing? Should I really be doing this? You got to commit. You got to believe you can do it. And so the mindset is, I'm committed to IoT. I fully know in the back of my mind it might be wrong. All right, now it makes a certain prediction. It predicts that consciousness may be much more widespread than we think. Now that is many people have thought this, right? We're not the only ones. There's a venerable tradition going back all the way to Plato that had sort of similar, some of mankind's deepest thinker, Spinoza, Schopenhauer, Russell, some of us, lots of scientists had these. So yes, it sounds far out because most people think consciousness, okay, it's you and me and maybe my dog and maybe great apes. That's it. But there's pretty universal agreement certainly among all biologists that mammals, dogs and cats and particular mice that people study in labs, they are similar to us. They don't talk. But if I give you a little bit piece of brain matter from a mouse, from a dog, from a human, from a monkey, nobody but an expert armed with a microscope can tell them apart. The basic stuff is all the same. Our behavior is similar. We are all closely evolutionary related. So it would be mind-boggling if only we had experience of pain and pleasure, seeing and hearing, and other mammals are unconscious. That would be just mind-boggling. It would totally make us very, very special, and there isn't any evidence for it and for that. And then you just keep on pushing it. Well, what's special about the mammals? I mean, they're birds that are incredible, corvids, ravens, they're incredibly complicated. They can have thousands of places where they hide food. What about octopus? What about bees? These are all very complicated, they have complicated brains and complicated behaviors. Isn't it likely that it feels like something to be a bee? And then you ask yourself, well, is there a threshold? Is it like, okay, the worm doesn't have it and the fly does, or maybe the fly doesn't have it, but the bee. So do you need a magical number of neurons, let's say 42, to pick a random number? Do you need maybe 42 neurons hooked together and then you're conscious, but with 41, you're not conscious? That sounds very implausible. And so in that sense, you can say, yes, maybe we can push it down, let's say, to single cells, maybe a paramecium, which is, I'd like to point out, a single cell paramecium, one of these animalcules that people discovered, in the 1630s when they first built a microscope. They're already so complex that not a single computer simulation today captures all the vast complexity of the molecular interactions in a single cell. It has an incredible amount of complexity. So how do we know that it doesn't feel a little bit like something to be a paramecium? It doesn't have anger or isn't upset about its wobbly shape. But what I mean, it may feel like something just a little bit light of experience to be an intact paramecium. And once it dies, it dissolves into its constituent part. It doesn't feel like anything anymore. And then you can push it down even further. You can say, well, is there some special property, some magical property that evolved systems have, like a paramecium or a dog or you, that a purely physical system that isn't evolved, like elementary particles doesn't have? And we can't think of anybody. If you talk to philosophers or others, there isn't, since we left the idea of a soul behind, several hundred years ago, there isn't really some other magical property that only evolved system have. And then, yes, in the limit, it may be possible that even elementary particles that themselves are system consisting out of, smaller systems like quarks may feel like something. Now, a useful metaphor, because most people say, well, that's completely crazy. A useful metaphor is, how cold is deep space? Now we know deep space is utterly cold. If you and I were, or any creature alive would be released into deep space, would instantly die. Well, of course, there's no air there, but also in terms of the temperature, we would instantly, shatter, as it were. However, we know from background radiation there is a tiny bit of energy left. Right? There's a tiny bit of there is a little bit of temperature in deep space. It's the afterglow left over from the creation, from the Big Bang, the creation of our particular universe. And so in that sense, you can say, yes, there's still a tiny bit of heat in sort of what we think of empty space. And yes, similar, it may be that it feels a tiny bit like something to be an elementary particle, but we try not to stress it, because right now I have no idea how to test that. I can test consciousness in you and me, and maybe in dogs and cats and mice, but I have no idea how to test it there. But it's an interesting implication, and it has a long intellectual pedigree.
All right, that was a great defense of IIT. It certainly is a profound. I see this as quite analogous, and sort of, in fact, it's kind of the in some ways the larger problem of life. How do you go from an inanimate, strictly physical universe to suddenly a universe that has bacteria on Earth 3.5 billion years ago that then became creatures like us, that are conscious. What's the transition point? You want a general theory of life in the same way that you want a general theory of consciousness. We don't have either right now. I can understand.
But Yorila, that's exactly right. But we believe there is no magical point where you can say, okay, now it's alive.
Right.
You take so many atoms and it's still physics, and now you add one and now suddenly it's alive. No, it's a system property that might emerge ultimately it's just physics. And so it's similar IIT says, well, no, it's part and parcel of the universe. It's physical systems look like something to the outside. That's what physics ultimately studies, but they also feel like something from the inside. That's what conscious experience is. So your experience is the way your physical brain feels from the inside.
Okay, so maybe we can go back to that, but I wanted to make sure that I get to the reason why I decided to write my book, and to start with you, and why I devoted a whole chapter to you, because when I first heard you describe IIT, I thought, wow, Christof has really gone off the deep end, and what the hell is going on with him? And then you had very helpfully written this book, The Quest for Consciousness, in which you talk about an identity crisis that you'd gone through. So, a bunch of different things had happened. You quite extraordinarily, actually, you had been a Catholic for most of your life until the late 1990s. And then you lost your faith. And you described that in your book, and you described it in stories online. You also you're getting older. You're approaching your 50th birthday. Your father died, so you're feeling your mortality. I'm just projecting on you, but this is also what you yourself were saying in your own book. And I felt like you were thinking you needed something more. You needed something more from science than you were getting from the neural correlates of consciousness, this kind of nitty-gritty but slightly boring approach to consciousness. I hope you don't mind my saying that. And so integrated information theory came along, which is this really exciting, ambitious theory that explains finally what the relationship of consciousness to the rest of the universe is, and the relationship of consciousness to matter. And you embraced it because you were going through some of this emotional turmoil. That was what I tried to show, or I argued in my chapter about you, in my book. And the larger point I tried to make is that, of course, our intellectual views are going to be infected by our personal lives, by our our suffering, by the good things that happen to us, the bad things, by our recognition of ourselves as mortal creatures who only have a certain amount of time left on Earth. So I guess I'm just looking for your reaction to this idea of mine, which seems to me to be a very important qualification for all our attempts to understand consciousness and the mind-body problem. We're trying to reduce consciousness to a totally objective problem. And my feeling, and this is something I only came to after thinking about your particular life and career, now I don't think we can get rid of subjectivity. That any more than we can get rid of subjectivity when we're trying to figure out who we are as individuals. That the subjective and the objective are all intertwined. The emotional and the rational are all intertwined.
Well, okay, yes and no. So if you're involved in creating a theory like this, yes, there are myriad of personal idiosyncratic reasons why you like one theory over the other. I totally agree with you. And maybe, it's very difficult to introspect because those parts of the brain really aren't accessible to your mind. Yes, maybe what you're saying it sounds plausible. It all sounds plausible. But the thing to stress is that for somebody else, so let's say for my students or another scientist, who's never met me and who just reads it online, either this is a good approximation, either it's a correct theory or it goes in the right way or it's not. So that's a genius of science. Well, once you remove this, the success or failure of a theory should not depend on the individuals who created it. No matter who Albert Einstein was and what his personal reasons were for it. Not that I want to compare myself in a second to Einstein, but it's very obvious. No matter who Darwin was or Einstein was or the founders of quantum mechanics was, it doesn't matter. Either the theory adequately describes reality or it doesn't. And so in that sense, I disagree with you that ultimately consciousness can be captured by integrated information theory and by phi, and ultimately its predictions are true or they're not true. That should not depend on your personal biography or my personal biography.
Well, so this is why I'd like to say that the mind-body problem can be rephrased as the question of who we really are. We're trying to understand, what are we? What does it mean to be human? And I guess, and I always used to see the problem the same way that you did, and I would assume that through science and reason, we are going to converge on one correct way of seeing the problem, and that will be it. In the same way that we have converged, at least so far, on a correct way of seeing gravity or heredity. But the mind-body problem is different from all those other problems. This gets back to what David Chalmers was saying about the hard problem. And humanity is a moving target. We as individuals are moving targets. And I'm talking about the mind-body problem in its broad sense, as you described it before, including not only consciousness, but also the self and free will, and even the problem of morality, what should be, as well as what is. And it seems to me, I'm even beginning to think that it's wrong. It's dangerous for us to think that there is a single solution to the mind-body problem, because then we will, if we think that, we might foreclose other possibilities that will inhibit our creativity and our freedom, our discovery of new ways to be human. But that's how I'm starting to think of it now.
Okay, so I just have to fundamentally disagree with you. So I don't know about morality and ethics. Those are very difficult questions, and I have not thought deeply about them. But the first and foremost role of a scientist is to describe the universe as it is, not as it should be. Right? It's not about prescription or how it should act. Those follows from scientific discovery. Once again, general relativity is the best description we have of the cosmos at large. And now you can take, what are the implications for ethics? Well, for general relativity, there aren't that many. Once you have a right theory of consciousness, if that describes conscious experience, not just in humans, you keep on saying humanity. I have a much broader remit. I want to explain consciousness in all creatures. In my dog, for instance, my dog has conscious experience, and I need to explain them just as well as I need to explain my conscious experiences. And that will have an explanation. And once we have that explanation, if it's a correct one, then that's it. And that, yes, it restricts your fecundity of just like relativity theory, does not leave room for magical carpets to, defy gravity, but it gives you the possibility of, once you understand gravity, of building maybe anti-gravity devices once you really understand the theory. So I want to understand the universe I'm born into. I believe, because science has shown me, at least in physics and in biology, seems to work very well. There are relatively simple universal laws that explain everything, including consciousness. And my mission is to try to derive such a description.
Would you say that you are more confident now that consciousness can be solved than you were when I first met you in the early 90s, or let's say in the late 90s, when you were doing work on the neural code and
Yes, yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, why should we not? What's all this defeatism? Why should we not sort of be in a position to understand? I grant you, there's no law that says human cognition can understand everything that is. That's an empirical proposition. So we'll just have to sort of work at it. And once again, it's early days. We've only been at it for several thousand years. Real progress only happened over the last 100 years, and it's accelerating. So yes, I'm very optimistic. Is IIT the right theory? I like to believe it goes in the right direction, but I know that it may turn out, some of its prediction may turn out to be wrong, but that's progress again.
All right, so let me see if you agree with me on this. I said I went to the first conference in Tucson on consciousness in 1994. Things were pretty chaotic then, but it seemed to me that it looked like there might be convergence toward the paradigm that you and Crick were laying out, the neural correlates of consciousness. This is the way that science could make incremental progress toward solving this problem. All right, I went back in 2016 to Tucson, and it was just crazy. I mean, it was, everything was wide open. There was still the neural correlates of consciousness in there, but psychedelics were really big. There was a much bigger presence for parapsychology, mysticism, all kinds of sort of spiritual metaphysics, Bayes' theorem, a lot of different information theories, not just IIT. And so the way I described this was, it wasn't a paradigm shift, it was a paradigm explosion. There's no convergence at all. In fact, it looked like divergence away from any kind of central core of beliefs. And I thought that this was great. The old skeptical, kind of mean-spirited Scientific American journalist John Horgan would have thought that that conference showed that the scientists are clueless, they're going backwards, if anything. But now I sort of feel like, I see all these different theories of as expressions of our creativity and our multiplicity. And I think the more theories, the better. That's my happy spin on this trend.
No, because that's like saying, well, the more theories of cosmology we have, the better it is. But ultimately, there's going to be one explanation, and we need to find out what that explanation is, because that's the best. We're looking for the one that explains the most diverse set of facts in the most parsimonious manner possible. That's in general what theoreticians are trying to do. And so there will be one. I claim there is one. IIT may be one of the candidates. The other good candidate is Global Neuronal Workspace. And then once we have that, there isn't any inherent diversity. It's much touted about, of course, diversity in the workforce and all of that. But in science, ultimately, you want the best explanation. and talking about magic and mysticism and all these other things, that's fine, you know, as a political thing. If people want to believe that, they're free to believe as long as they don't hurt anybody. But if we really want to if we want to help people with schizophrenia, right? If we want to detect consciousness in patients that unresponsive wakeful coma, unresponsive wakeful state where you don't know is there anybody there or not, we better need a truth theory of consciousness that actually tells us something about real brains, why are they wrong, and how we can fix them. And for that, we need a scientific theory.
All right, I've just got one more question for you. Then
what's the motto? What's the state motto of the United States of America? E pluribus unum, out of many one.
Okay.
All right, so likewise, that applies for IIT, because IIT takes that and actually measures it, right? The one is what that is, you know, that's defined consciousness, but also in ultimately in scientific theory, we want one theory that explains the largest number of facts.
Right. Okay, I'm just playing off your emphasis just a little bit ago on applications. I do agree that if you're talking not just about how theories can console us and help us make sense of our own lives and find meaning in the universe, if you're concerned with solving problems like mental illness, then you know, the empirical approach is absolutely crucial. And I just wanted to ask you about an op-ed of yours that came out within the last year that I have to say really alarmed me. And again, it's because I've known you for a while, and I think of you as being sort of the archetypal, reasonable person. This was your op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, where I'm going to paraphrase, and you tell me if I'm wrong. You were saying that you're worried about machines becoming super intelligent and racing past us, and maybe dominating our society in some way, and that we need to keep up with the super intelligent machines. And one way to do that is with implanted brain chips. And so you were calling for a big crash program on implanted brain chips that could help us soup up our minds and keep up with the super intelligent machines. And that bothers me for a bunch of reasons. I can link to a piece where I wrote about it. But I wonder if just what your thinking was, if you still hold to that view, you still think that this is a good idea, we need lots of brain chips. What's going on there?
Well, okay, so this is now unrelated to the topic of consciousness, right? Yeah, so look, why are we the dominant species on the planet? We're the dominant species not because we are the most beautiful or the fastest or the most powerful. In terms of our muscular system, we are the dominant because we are the smartest, right? And we survive by being intelligent. And particularly in today's society, we stratified according to intelligence. So now here we are trying to build as fast as we can intelligence into systems, in particular into autonomous systems, and in particular into autonomous systems that can fight wars better and better. And at some point, of course, there will be no more humans in the loop because, for reasons of autonomy, that's best. And the question is that really such a good idea? And, there are lots of people, Elon Musk, the philosopher Nick Bostrom, etc., who have publicly, discussed this fact that developing intelligence or machines that are more intelligent than us, and of course there's no natural limitation to intelligence. We can certainly improve upon human intelligence. Just look around. Is that really such a good idea? Now it looks like it's happening. There's no central effort given the state of the planet right now to control any of that. Instead, all companies and all the militaries are busy developing their own, artificial intelligence. And so the question is, one way how we can keep up, in a sense, is if we take some of the best abilities of what computers can do, and over the medium term, we're not talking about next year, we're talking about, the next generation or two, take some of those things and put them into our brain. We can certainly improve our brains. We know there are many things that could be improved, our brains, And I see no reason why we shouldn't, if people want that, help improve our brains using such technology.
All right. So here's the really final question. That made me think that you're worried about the future. You're pessimistic about the future. How are you feeling about, I don't know, the state of humanity right now? You have children. Are you thinking that life is going to be good for them?
I'm not sure anymore. It is true. I grew up being profoundly optimistic, and I believe that my children will go walk the sand dunes of Mars. Elon Musk's effort and SpaceX withstanding, I'm not sure how likely that's going to be. On the other hand, I fully well realize that if you lived in, let's see, the early 17th centuries, when Black Death and the 30 Years' War devastated Europe and killed 1 out of 3 Europeans alive, if you look at the end of World War I, mass slaughter, so there have been many other inflection points in history where things look pretty bleak, and we are, after all, 7 billion people. You could be pessimistic, but you could also be optimistic about the long-term trend of humanity. We will survive, I think. We will change. We'll change very rapidly. The change will accelerate. And can we, as organized society, keep up with that change without going into societal modes that are very different from the ones we're currently experiencing? And that remains an open question. So over the long term, I continue to be optimistic, but not this sort of, I've lost sort of this naive techno-optimism I had, as a youngster. We better actively intervene to shape the future we want. Otherwise, we're going to get the future that we may not want.
All right. Let's end on that wisdom right there. Thanks a lot, Christof. I really enjoyed it.
That was fun, John.